In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of economic methodology. One distinction we make in economics is between positive and normative economics. Positive economics involves an attempt to describe how the economy functions. It uses a scientific method, which you may recall from earlier coursework in elementary school, middle school, or high school, and it relies on testable hypotheses, where you have a tentative explanation of how things work. Then you use data to evaluate that, and you either reject the hypothesis or you fail to reject it and you test some more. Normative economics, on the other hand, relies on value judgments to evaluate the overall functioning of the economy. Consider the following two statements. The first is, the proposed changes in the tax code would increase income inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient. Second statement is, the proposed change in the tax code would make the distribution of income less fair. The first statement is something where you can conduct a test. You can observe what happens in response to a change in the tax code. And either the Gini coefficient would go up or it would not if you control for other factors. The second statement relies on this notion of fairness. And might two people agree as to what happens, but disagree in terms of whether they think the income distribution is more or less fair. As a result of that, the second statement is normative and the first is positive. Positive economics relies on the use of abstraction. Now consider where we see the word abstract. One common usage of abstract, or one of the first things you might think about, is abstract art. And one of the most common forms of that is cubism. And essentially what cubists try to do is they take a complex reality and reduce it to its essential shapes or forms. Another use of the word abstract is an abstract for a journal article, where you take a complex study, which may be several dozen pages, and you reduce it to one or two paragraphs describing what was studied and what results were found. Both of those illustrate the concept of abstraction, which is taking a complex reality and simplifying it. One way in which the simplification takes place in economics and other disciplines is with the use of the ceteris paribus assumption. Under the ceteris paribus assumption, we hold other things equal, which is what ceteris paribus translates as. And we do that basically so we can focus on the relationship between two variables in isolation, holding constant all other factors that affect the variable you're trying to explain. And so if we're thinking, for example, about the determinants of demand, we'd look at all the factors that affect demand, holding all the others constant. When we test the usefulness of economic models, which are by their nature relatively abstract, we generally test them based on how well they predict, not on how realistic their assumptions are. Milton Friedman many years ago suggested an analogy that was useful, that if you want to understand the shots made by an expert pool player, perhaps the best model to do that would be to use the laws of physics, things such as the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection, and that if you hit a pool ball with a vector force parallel to the table, hitting the ball 2/3 of the radius above the center would result in zero forward torque. Now, of course, if we asked a pool player if they did that, they probably laugh at you and not quite understand what you are asking. But the model is likely to work pretty well than any of the more intuitive explanations perhaps that the pool player may give in terms of what shot they chose at any particular time. In normative economics, one problem that's faced is that disputes cannot be resolved based on evidence because it's based on your values, and different peoples have different values about what they consider to be optimal or fair or just. If we could somehow measure the gains and losses of happiness, which economists call utility, then we could engage in interpersonal comparisons. But we can't compare the happiness of one person with the happiness of another. So in most cases in which we're evaluating alternative policies, some people gain and some people lose. And because we can't determine whether the gains to some are larger or smaller than the losses to other, we're not able to evaluate a situation where not everybody benefits. One case, though, that most economists agree on is that Pareto improvements are good. And as you may recall from earlier courses, a Pareto improvement is a change that benefits one or more people and doesn't harm anyone. That's a normative concept, but it's one which pretty much everyone tends to agree with. The concept of Pareto optimality, also known as economic efficiency, is a state that occurs when all possible Pareto improvements have already been made. In other words, in a state of Pareto optimality, any change that benefits someone would make someone else worse off. Another way of putting it is you've reached economic efficiency or Pareto optimality if any change would tend to harm someone. One critique of the concept of Pareto optimality is that it puts perhaps an undue weight on the status quo, because in general it's hard to imagine many changes that didn't harm at least one person. One trade-off we often find in economics, and we'll see this quite a bit in some of the topics we'll be discussing in the course this semester, is the trade-off between equity and efficiency. In general, any attempts to make market outcomes more equitable or more fair in a broad sense often results in the loss of economic efficiency. A simple example of this, if we tried to ensure that everyone had equal pay, no matter how hard they worked or how much they worked, then we could end up with an incentive system where people were encouraged to not work at all. And that type of outcome is likely to impede economic efficiency. Under ideal conditions, markets may achieve economic efficiency or Pareto optimality. In particular, the ideal conditions, as you may recall from your principles class, involve things like no external benefits or costs, the good is a purely private good, that everyone has perfect information, and so forth. And then in those conditions, the interaction between buyers and sellers, who are all well informed, will result in situations in which both parties gain from a transaction. In other words, whenever people choose to buy things at a market price, it makes them better off. When people choose to sell things at a market price, it makes them better off. So a competitive equilibrium under ideal conditions makes everyone better off. As a result, it would result in a state of Pareto optimality. Unfortunately, though, ideal conditions are not generally met, and in fact, often may be rarely met. That there are often elements of market failure where we have market concentration on one side of the market, we have monopolies or monopsonies, we have externalities, or the good may have some public aspects to it, in which case market outcomes may not be ideal. And we'll talk about all these issues as we move through the course.